We're at the midpoint of 2017, and with the scene going through somewhat of a transition with new games recently coming out, some just on the horizon, and some who it may very well be their last hurrah, what better time than now to take a look at the landscape of the fighting game community in 2017. While there were many titles to choose from, here are 12 games I feel deserve our attention, as well as how they currently stand to affect the fighting game community. Now, before we get to the games, I have to put this out there, and while you might disagree with me, I do not consider the Smash Bros. Titles as FGC proper games. Therefore, you should not expect them on this list. Killer Instinct has been a solid fighting game for the community since its release, with Season 1 dating back to early 2014. What KI brings to the table is unique character design, as no one character feels, looks, or plays like another. Its combo system is catered to a more casual audience, however, the game does get a bit more difficult when taking in some of the deeper intricacies and defensive habits of the game. At higher levels, the game is fairly entertaining to watch from a spectatorship point of view, as it has a nice mix of almost Street Fighter IV meets Mortal Kombat X type gameplay. Where KI suffers the most is with its community, which while they're a dedicated bunch, it's just that there are not many of them. This is mostly attributed to the game being only on Xbox One and PC, where there's simply less traffic among FGC members. While its community might not be large, the game has a pretty decent netcode, making online a pretty smooth experience. The days of the main stage might be over for KI, but the game is definitely still worth watching at high tournament level.
Persona 4 Arena Ultimax!
Persona 4 Arena Ultimax, or better known as P4U2, has been a fighting game title I never believed got its due. Not only did the game offer solid fighting mechanics, stylish visuals, and game modes that aided both the absolute beginner and the seasoned veteran, the game's playable cast was already widely recognized due to the commercial success of both Persona 3 and Persona 4. However, as much as it pains me to say this, considering P4U2 is my all-time favorite fighting game, its competitive days are pretty much over, and the game only lives on in very small circles in a much deteriorated online community. From a spectatorship standpoint, P4U2 wasn't for everyone, as it wasn't as captivating if you didn't exactly know what was going on, or what to look for. Understanding things like awakening health, burst status, etc. made spectating all that much more exciting. However, the game did have quite the positive presence at EVO 2015 with a competitive top 8 and a surprising grand final result. As it currently stands, unless the long-coveted 2.0 patch comes to the West, a competitive comeback is unlikely for P4U2. I would still recommend fans of Persona 3 and Persona 4 to try out P4U2, especially considering the game's story mode is canon. While the online community is pretty scarce nowadays, there are plenty of offline modes to keep you interested until that elusive match pops up. Tekken 7 is perhaps the most important game on this list, not because it plays, looks, or has the best characters, but because its potential reaches farther than any other game in the fighting game community. It's a little less than 2 weeks away, but with everything we've seen from Tekken 7, we can conclude that while it's not perfect, Bandai Namco has done everything in their capability to create a comprehensive fighting game experience. Tekken 7 is perhaps the best looking fighting game in motion, perhaps only second to Guilty Gear Xrd Revelator 2, which makes it pretty spectator friendly even to the casual observer. The gameplay in Tekken has eased up a bit from previous iterations of the game, and necessary additions like rage arts and resourceful game modes will aid in bringing in new players. There's a large pool of characters to choose from, both new to the series as well as some familiar faces, all of whom vary both in difficulty and style. Nevertheless, where Tekken 7 is the same is while it has eased up a bit mechanically, its target market is still very much the hardcore fighting game community. Therefore, while the game does come with a bunch of bells and whistles, at its core it's still not an easy game to just pick up, and mechanically takes time to get used to, which may hinder newer audience to engage with it in a long-term sense. With the state of the community being a bit on shaky legs, there is a crucial need for a flagship game, and with everything Tekken 7 offers, and Bandai Namco, which has proven themselves as an attending developer by listening to the critiques of its fans, Tekken 7 could very well be on its way to being the new go-to game for the fighting game community. The final chapter hasn't been written on the game, however, less than 2 weeks away, I don't see a future where Tekken 7 is anything but a good game at this point. Its far-reaching potential has the ability to attract both new players while still catering to the hardcore fighting game audience. As somewhat of an outsider to the series, I can't speak too in-depthly about the BlazBlue games, but I do appreciate what they bring to the table, and the case of BlazBlue Central Fiction is no different. Central Fiction is what I would best describe as the middle ground between the Persona series and the Guilty Gear series. While it's a little more complex than the Arena games, it doesn't have nearly the barrier to entry as the Guilty Gear series. Aside from some inside baseball game meta and defensive options, the mechanics are fairly simple to get a hold of. Gameplay is fast-paced, but on a standard level of an anime fighting game. There's a good mix of bad guy, good guy when it comes to the character select screen, and from a spectatorship standpoint, the game is pretty enjoyable, especially if you like anime. The only objection I have with Central Fiction and the BlazBlue series as a whole is that it's over-reliant on fan service. And that is a double-edged sword, because while it attracts a certain audience, it also deters a certain audience. And while the FGC may claim that they love fan service, the player numbers for the BlazBlue series show otherwise. While as a player it's not my cup of tea, I still think BlazBlue is a lot of fun to watch, and I think it's a good entry point to the FGC, especially if you're interested in other anime games. If I had made this list 6 months ago, I would have labeled Street Fighter V, not Tekken 7, as the most important game on this list. However, after a year plus of having the game around, I can wholeheartedly say that ship has long sailed. Street Fighter V came out stumbling with missing features, inconsistent mechanics, graphical disasters, an underwhelming launch roster, and a long list of other mishaps. Fast forward to mid-2017 and a couple of patches later, the game has stabilized some with added features, a more interesting Season 2 cast, and quote-unquote balance changes. But despite it all, it seems that the FGC and Capcom are at a crossroads, and it's only a matter of time until one side decides to actually commit to a road. The real unfortunate part of it all is that after having so much forward momentum at the tail end of 2015, as it currently stands, Capcom has just about reversed the situation completely. When it comes down to it, as I watch Street Fighter V, I don't see many gameplay elements that scream out, "This is Street Fighter," but instead I see a fighting game franchise that has seemingly lost its identity. While I don't believe many pro players will publicly admit it, it's starting to become obvious that Street Fighter V, as it currently stands, is held afloat by two things. The first being the casual market, who's been catered to with regards to the difficulty of the game, and secondly, the heavy marketing and promotion from Sony and Capcom in an effort to e-sportify the game, if you will, which in regards to sponsorships and exposure has been quite successful. However, the real question is what will become of the community if, and more likely when, the prize pots of Capcom Pro Tour either dwindle or vanish completely? Will pro players continue to support the game when there is no longer a heavy pot of gold at the end of the rainbow? And how long until the attention the game is getting from the casual market dissipates? Like it or not, as FGC members, we know that the success of Capcom and Street Fighter is a crucial component as to how far we can go and thrive as a community. However, that success has to come from within, and unfortunately with Street Fighter V, Capcom and Sony decided to reach outside for its success. And it's safe to say that while we can't say it has technically failed, that plan has definitely backfired. Considering we're this far along, it very well may be too late to change the outlook for Street Fighter V. While we can only hope for things to work out, if they don't, the situation could become a learning experience for both Capcom and the FGC. And hopefully in the future, the two sides can once again work together. While it's not a game that speaks to me, I can definitely see a more casual market enjoying Street Fighter V. It has some good things to offer with less demanding execution, its Season 2 characters, as well as being the frontrunner with regards to fighting game spectatorship. It might be the smallest community in fighting games, but it just also might be its most dedicated. In 2017, Melty Blood is very much a side tournament game. However, it's always entertaining to watch considering how simple it looks yet how mechanically deep it can play. While the art may be a bit outdated, a pretty decent soundtrack, traditional inputs with fairly easy execution, not to mention all its fun character designs, Melty Blood is a shoo-in for a fan favorite type game. While the odds for finding competition around you may not be very high, the overall gameplay is a lot of fun, even when playing the computer or just messing around in training mode. It doesn't have the fame or credential behind it, but Melty Blood is somewhat akin to fighting game comfort food. It's not necessarily fancy, but it has this endearing quality to it, which has allowed it to stay relevant in the fighting game community, even in 2017. To be quite frank, I've always viewed the KOF series players as quote-unquote badasses of the FGC, and that case remains so with King of Fighters XIV. While it's not as demanding as previous iterations, SNK has made it clear that the game is very much catered specifically to fighting game players, and not everyday gamers, which is something I can appreciate as an FGC member. Mechanically, as it's the series' forte, the game runs pretty deep. There are a lot of things to take in, such as the ability to play 3 characters proficiently, intermediate to somewhat harder execution requirements, as well as being ready to cancel moves into moves and then cancel them again into even more moves. However, the one thing I would say is true for King of Fighters 14, as it's been true with most KOF games, is that while it poses a more difficult entry point, if learned properly, it perhaps has the most benefit with regards to establishing fundamental skills like punishing accordingly, meter management, and footsiege, which cross over to almost any other fighting game. Difficulty aside, the one critique on KOF 14 is that visually from a character design standpoint, it is fairly underwhelming considering the console era it came out in. However, SNK has shown to be an attending developer by steadily making improvements with updates and communicating with the fighting game community. Lastly, by knowing the technical requirements that are needed in order to be successful, it's tough not to enjoy KOF from a spectator's point of view, as good fundamentals show themselves and high level play is always guaranteed to excite. With a little patience and a lot of practice, King of Fighters 14 could be a well worthwhile investment, both for new players interested in learning and veterans looking to challenge themselves. It's not out just yet in North America, however, considering it's a little more added innovation onto the base gameplay that is Uniel, we somewhat know what to expect of Uniel ST. It's going to be an anime fighting game that leans a little towards more grounded gameplay rather than the erratic pace set by games like P4U2 and Central Fiction. The game is pretty straightforward with regards to its technical tendencies, execution, overall meta aren't very difficult to get a hold of. There is a bit of a learning curve when it comes to the general mechanics of the game, but nothing too difficult to wrap your head around if you've been around fighting games before. Where the game does get overshadowed by its anime counterparts is with character diversity. From a tactical sense, characters play fairly different from each other. However, from a design standpoint, there aren't too many characters that stand out. This fact is shown even more true when the 2 of the game's most popular characters, in Akatsuki and Eltnum, aren't original Under Night and Birth characters, but actually guest characters from other games. The different paced gameplay does seem to resonate with the fighting game community when it comes to spectatorship, and I do think it's a nice middle ground for those interested in anime games but want more of a traditional style gameplay. Lastly, I can also see the game doing pretty well with regards to teaching skills which may carry over to other anime style fighting games.
Guilty Gear Xrd Rev 2.
It's not as difficult to pick up as the King of Fighters series, but Guilty Gear Xrd Revelator 2 is by far the hardest game to learn within its anime subgenre. Not so much with precise inputs, as I would put the execution at medium difficulty at best. Where Guilty Gear gets more difficult is within its somewhat more robust mechanical system, as there are many things to keep track of, such as burst, YRCs, dead angles, etc. The other factor that newer players may struggle with is the fact that there is a variety of different characters who all hold somewhat of a unique playstyle. In order to be successful defensively, matchup knowledge is relied upon heavily. With it being the most popular anime game on the market and one that perhaps has the highest ceiling as far as competitive skills, Guilty Gear is always enjoyable to watch. Of course, knowing a little bit about the game would help, however there is also an argument to be made that Guilty Gear Xrd Revelator 2 is perhaps the best looking game the fighting game community has to offer in 2017, which that reason alone makes it observer friendly even to a novice crowd. Despite a bit of a larger barrier to entry with regards to fighting game skills, Guilty Gear Xrd Revelator 2 has a lot to offer with its character diversity, impressive visuals, and one of the best soundtracks in fighting games. Mortal Kombat is perhaps only second to Street Fighter when it comes to most recognized names in fighting games, and MKX made sure to include those names and everything else that makes MK the entertaining spectacle that it is. It's safe to say that the Mortal Kombat series has always been more about just being a fighting game, but also a display for some gruesome scenes, and MKX is no different with all the fatalities, brutalities, and other bloody depictions that it encompasses. As a competitive fighting game, while it probably won't see the main stage anymore in larger tournaments, MKX still has a lot to offer with an impressive amount of characters to select from, as well as different variations, which lend to playing one character almost in 3 different ways. The only criticism I have with regards to the competitive landscape of Mortal Kombat X is the flocking to the top tier character. Considering the execution in MKX is easy at worst and matchup knowledge is somewhat non-existent due to the block button, the metagame of the game is really boiled down to breaking throws and mixing up overheads with lows. While there are a few zoners and command grabbing characters, the characters that can reduce the risk reward of the high-low game are usually the ones that succeed in competitive settings. And so despite having a wide roster of characters, the names at the top are there for a reason. Nevertheless, Mortal Kombat has always been about crazy and fun rather than technical gameplay, and in that aspect, MKX fits the script. It's a little too early to judge Injustice 2 with regards how it affects the FGC in 2017, however after about a week and change post-launch, the fighting game community has been relatively happy with how the game is turning out. The game seems to be somewhat of a good balance with the original of the series with some influences from MKX. The only two areas of concern have to do with the graphical inconsistencies, as some facial models just seem somewhat rushed and a bit awkward looking, and secondly the issue of balance, which always seems to haunt NetherRealm Studio games. As of launch, the narrative of Injustice 2 has so far been the rise of the Deadshot zoning army, which in all likelihood will fall once a balance update arrives. It's early, but the beginner-friendly combat combined with recognizable superhero characters, Injustice 2 is looking to be another staple title for NRS, pending some polishing and mechanical fixes. Considering it's slated for September of 2017, talking about the ins and outs of Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite just seems silly, as in all likelihood the game will experience many changes and updates in the foreseeable future. However, with the early footage and information available, there are a few conclusions that can be made with regards to how the game will affect the landscape of the FGC in 2017. The first is that, similar to Street Fighter V, Capcom is looking to ease up with mechanics and cater to a wider audience by simplifying controls. Secondly, and a bit more concerning, is that while it's still early, the game is pretty graphically underwhelming, both in design and animation. And lastly, and what could perhaps be the biggest source of trepidation for the FGC, is that Capcom is at the helm of MVCI, and it's unlikely that the game will get the financial support and exposure Street Fighter V received since launch. It's an unpredictable situation, however, putting into consideration how Capcom has gone about things recently, Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite may or may not be in trouble. While I know there are many other fighting games that will be a part of the FGC landscape in 2017, the 12 I mentioned felt deserving enough as they each have their own different and interesting narratives, and ones I feel are worth keeping an eye out for. While I do think there are some games with a higher stock than others, I personally am excited for the rest of 2017 and the future of the fighting game scene, both as a player and spectator.